My guest today is Dr. Michael Koehle. Dr. Koehle is a researcher, physician, and athlete. He currently works at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, as a sports medicine doc, professor, and as the director of the Environmental Physiology Laboratory, where he studies how extremes in the environment impact health and athletic performance. Dr. Koehle is also the team doctor for Athletics Canada, working closely with the team at the Canadian Sports Institute. I wanted to have Dr. Koehle on to tackle questions about health and exercise in and around air pollution. This is an area that Michael is a leading expert in, and maybe a topic that I get asked about most frequently as we deal with different environmental extremes, like wildfire smoke, exercising in metropolitan areas, and enduring cold winter air temps. Hopefully we answer some of your burning questions here today, and if we missed anything, reach out. We'd love to tackle them in another episode. Dr. Koehle, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. You are someone that I've been thinking about reaching out to for a very long time. The Pacific Northwest has been my home for a long time. I was a grad student up in Vancouver. So I've kind of been following your career at UBC for a while now. And from following along with the publications, it sounds like things have been slowly shifting from when I think back in 2017, I spent a night at Hotel Hypoxia. And so I'm wondering for our listening audience who might not be as familiar with your work, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself as a researcher, as a physician, as an athlete, and then the work that you have been doing in the past, and then what you're working on kind of right now actively in the lab.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think both of us spent a bunch of time in the same lab at SFU. I just did it a long time ago. I did a postdoc there until, I don't know, 2008 or something like that. So a while ago. In terms of my background, so you're right, I'm a physician. I practice sports medicine at the University of British Columbia, and I have a clinical practice there, and I also take care of a few professional endurance athletes, and I'm also a physician with Athletics Canada, so that's our track and field national team. And from a research point of view, most of my research is environmental physiology, so really the interaction between exercise and the environment. And so in the past, I've done a bit of stuff related to heat and maybe a bit related to cold and diving, but most of the work has been related to high altitude uh, and um, and now more recently air pollution. And so in terms of the high altitude stuff, that's where you mentioned hotel hypoxia. In one of our labs at UBC, we have a altitude chamber with bunk beds in it, and we were doing a lot of research in the sort of health effects around altitude illness. And acute mountain sickness and high altitude cerebral edema, and doing a lot of that in the past, and then a bit more performance work. You're probably involved in or you were definitely involved in a study that was looking really at performance at altitude, especially in runners. And one of the things they were looking at is, how does the altitude affect your performance, and how does sleeping the night before an event affect your performance? And that was now Dr. Eric Carter's PhD thesis that you're involved in. But more recently, I've moved into more and more air pollution. I guess we started researching air pollution and exercise in about 2009, but it's taken a while to um, build our capacity there. And so that hotel hypoxia altitude chamber is now also an ozone chamber. And so we can deliver high levels of ozone air pollution. And actually, we were talking about doing a combined study because I was just talking to a physiologist who was just down in Dr. Gareth Sanford he was in Flagstaff with Athletics Canada, and finding that some of the athletes were responding a bit to combined ozone and altitude, negatively responding. And so that's something we'll need to look at too. So environment and exercise and how they interact, I guess, is our research.
Yeah, broadly. And that was a horrible study. I think they woke us up early in the morning and then we had to do 2 VO2 max tests like right away. And it was a rude awakening, but very fun to kind of get to be a part of someone else's PhD work. And Eric is, I don't know, maybe one of the fastest PhDs out there. Very, very talented athlete and coach in his own right as well. I'm curious a little bit about the kind of the pivot. The environmental stuff I think is so interesting, and I know my interest going into grad school was really, was spurred by this applied physiology, this athletic performance lens, and then it very rapidly shifted to kind of this, yes, this performance lens, but also the broader health implications of these environmental conditions. And I'm wondering if any of that has kind of, I mean, one, it's funding, right? What is getting funded and what is the reality of the world that we're living in? But I'm wondering if that at all has shaped your lens of research, going from some of this performance stuff, but also adding in obviously air pollution. Yes, it does affect exercise and performance, but it's got very real world health implications as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the funding issue, in that it's easy, generally easier to get funded for things that are health related as opposed to performance related. But um, still, it's still possible to do both, and I'm fortunate to be able to do both. I think um, moving, even when I was doing altitude stuff, it was mostly health work, in that I did a bit in our lab, but I did a lot of the research in Nepal, field work in Nepal, and that was a bit. Uh, I was working there clinically, and then I sort of uh, was working in a high altitude clinic, and that sort of spurred some ideas of research we could do. And it was, it's a bit self-serving, and that kind of field work is naturally pretty fun too. And so one of the quotations that as a scientist I live by is someone, I forget who said it. It certainly wasn't me. It's if you can study a fish in Cleveland, study a different fish, and hopefully your listeners from Cleveland won't be too offended by that. But it's just the the idea was just that, if you can make your research interesting and take you to interesting places, then that'll make things a little more interesting. And both clinically and research wise, I've been fortunate to be able to travel a fair bit. And so in Nepal, you're really studying health and the health side of things. And then I guess uh, what my very first PhD student, Dr. Louisa Giles, is very, we actually were working together at SFU, Simon Fraser University at the time, and we were really interested in active commuting, right? Cycling or walking to work as sort of all the benefits personally, and both personally but also environmentally. And we kept sort of coming back to the question about air pollution and how that affects things. And so I think that was the framework upon which she built her thesis. And her first question was that she wanted to get to the bottom of was, if the air pollution is bad, should you really take it easy on your bike on the way to work and spend more time in the air pollution but have lower exercise intensity, or should you get on your bike and hammer? And so that was sort of one of the studies for her thesis, and that was the beginning of our work in the air pollution area, and it's been interesting, and there's lots and lots more to do.
Yeah, it's definitely a growing field of interest, and one that I think I'm really happy is a growing field of interest. And part of that, right, you've mentioned like ozone, air pollution, but obviously there's many different kind of types of air pollution. Many of us in the Mountain West are too well versed in wildfire smoke, for example, or we get dust storms that blow sand, from the desert all the way to Texas or all the way to the mountain slopes in France. Air quality, there are many, many things that impact air quality, and I'm wondering, for our listening audience, how can we differentiate what those types of, I guess, air pollution factors are, or air quality, like things that would impact air quality, just so that we can kind of wrap our brains around, okay, what are we talking about when we say ozone? What are we talking about when we say like particulate matter, in a way that, makes sense to their day-to-day lives, be it commuting, be it dealing with wildfires, etc.
Yeah, yeah, hey, you're really wise to bring up that point, because air pollution isn't one single thing. It's like a recipe. And your air pollution late summer and wildfire season in the Mountain West is very different from say, air pollution that we had during the Olympics last August in Japan, right? And every day, every time of day, every location, the weather, it all changes the air pollution. And it's sort of to to understand it, you have to understand the recipe. And the recipe for air pollution is basically you mix a bunch of particles, solid and liquid particles, and gases. And those solid and liquid particles are many of the things you talked about. So dust coming up off the roads and the prairies, and pollen, and then soot from carbon particles from wildfire is a huge issue, especially in the Mountain West and the Pacific Northwest. And then we also have other particles, heavy metals that come out from internal combustion, and liquids, little droplets, and how they mix and the various concentrations of each affect the air pollution. And that's just the particle side of things. And then there's the gas side of things. And so you mentioned ozone. Ground level ozone is a common pollutant, something that we see in hot, sunny environments typically. So Los Angeles was famous for having really high levels of ozone in the past, and Japan has particularly high levels. But the reason that it's connected to sunlight and heat is that ozone is a secondary pollutant, meaning that it doesn't come out of the tailpipe of a car or out of a smokestack. It actually is, you take all primary pollutants like volatile organic compounds or oxides of nitrogen and products of internal combustion, and then you convert them with ultraviolet light from the sun, um, and that creates ground level ozone, which is one of the key gases that make up air pollution. And you talk about the Mountain West. It's interesting. One of my colleagues, Dr. Nadine Bourdois Dedekindé, always reminds me that in the winter in Utah, there's high ozone levels.
And
And
smog, and same in Chamonix.
yeah, yeah. Um, and the Utah ozone has something to do with it's some sort of petrochemical release during the winter coming off. And you're right, Chamonix has horrible air quality. Actually, that valley, the Salange Valley, leading up to Chamonix, is apparently the worst in Europe in terms of air quality. Um,
Yeah, it's like the thermal effect in the winter. It's super fascinating, but I know so many athletes in both those valleys who, that's what they're stuck with. That's what they're dealing with every winter. Yeah, outside of Salt Lake City, like in the Chamonix Valley. It's it's not what people I think naturally think of though when they think of air pollution. I think they think of I'm running or riding around vehicles, or I live in an industrial or an urban area, or there's a wildfire and I can clearly see what's happening. The wind has blown X, Y, or Z part like particulate matter into our air. But I think it's important that we visualize all these different factors that can be present in our day to day lives.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the biggest take-home messages for your athletes and coaches. Just know your situation, right? Because you think Chamonix, it's the Alps, right? It's got to be gorgeous and perfect and away from any big cities. It's got to have low air quality, low air pollution levels, and it's absolutely not. There's a lot of industrial sources there. It's trapped in the valley, and then there's the tunnel to Italy there, and the huge lineup of diesel cars up above town and through town all the way through there. And so I guess it's sort of don't take it for granted. And same thing with Colorado. It's most of the time it's great, but for several weeks in late summer every year, more and more frequently, the air quality is horrible because of the wildfires.
Yeah. And some of these things I feel like are very visible. Like you can tell when our air quality is poor in a lot of these areas. It's harder. My folks live in the Midwest, and the wildfires last year, I think particularly like in the Boundary Waters, were below it, and I think up into Canada were caused like my folks in northern Wisconsin for maybe the first time in my whole existence had horrible air quality in northern Wisconsin, just south of Lake Superior. And for them, it's like they couldn't tell because they're in this big treed area versus here. I'm in San Francisco right now. You can tell when we have poor air quality. You can visibly see it in the air versus I feel like sometimes with ozone, you can't necessarily recognize that it's always there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. And ozone is also hard to study because or if you're doing observational studies, because it's typically, with the exception of these these exceptions we talked about, say Utah in the winter, it's typically something we see on really hot, sunny days. And when we talk about exercise performance, our performance is negatively impacted by the heat for everybody, no matter how acclimated you are to the heat. And so on a hot sunny day, you do a race or a time trial or something like that, you're going to perform poorly. And how much of that is the ozone and how much of it is the heat itself and the humidity? And
Yeah,
so it's a bit of a double whammy that we have to deal with.
yeah, hard to parse that, and I cannot imagine how stressful that was for everyone going into Tokyo and going into Beijing, where I think air quality was a really big worry on everyone's minds. And now I'm excited to see kind of the papers that come out post Olympics, because they always do. It's always the research that's kind of been held by, the Canadian Sport Institute or the Australian Sport Institute that will slowly be released. Kind of this like in the past 6 months and then over this next year. But a question I think that's interesting is that most of us, when we hear about these warnings, these air quality warnings, right? You get the notification that, such and such population should be careful today or careful outside or watch your activity level. And as athletes, most of us are very healthy humans. We like to move our bodies. We see that warning and we think, it doesn't apply to us. But why in particular is exercise, like why in particular does exercise make your exposure worse in these scenarios, right? As opposed to being out as a normal human out for a walk or going about your day.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a really important question. And so, exercise, by definition, means that your metabolism or your metabolic rate is increased, right? And so, to undertake work, which is what exercise is, you need to increase your oxygen intake through increased ventilation. You're breathing more, and then you need to pump more blood to your exercising muscles, and so your cardiac output is more, and so all your bodily processes are increased manyfold. So sitting during this podcast talking, I'm probably breathing uh, 10 12 liters a minute, but at maximal exercise, I'm fairly tall, I could be breathing 180 liters a minute, right? And so just by pure dose, could be 15 times the dose of air pollution coming into my body at that time. And that's the other factor that's really important is during intense exercise, we tend to breathe more during our mouth, through our mouth. Um, and our mouth has no innate filtration, whereas our nose is designed as both a humidifier and a filter. And so it could scrub out a little bit of the air pollution breathing just through your nose. So by increasing the dose of pollutants coming in, increasing the metabolic rate in the body's, the speed of the body's processes, and then all the oral breathing over nasal breathing, we have many reasons to expect both the dose of air pollution to be higher, and in theory, the effects of air pollution to be greater on the body.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what athletes should be on the lookout for in a little bit. But I guess kind of piggybacking off, that we are at heightened, like we do have heightened exposure during exercise, particularly intense exercise. And then we've talked a little bit about particulate matter versus, ground ozone, air pollution. What is there one that's worse for us? Is there one that we should be more concerned about when it comes to, making these decisions about do I run, do I not run? Do I run hard? Do I not run hard? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think it's always good to break it down into health effects and performance effects. And so, because they're separate, and uh, and especially the health effects of air pollution over the long term are clear, right? Air pollution is one of the biggest environmental causes of mortality. It reduces our life expectancy. You live in an urban environment. If you live in an urban environment, you just have more risk of lung disease, including cancer, even chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, compared to living in a low pollution environment your whole life. And so, um, uh, it's really important to think of air pollution as bad for our health all day and night, and not just during exercise. And so there's really concrete negative health effects of air pollution. Um, and the performance effects are a bit more nuanced, and we'll get to them a little bit later. So your question, Corinne, was about which pollutant is worse for us, and I guess acutely during exercise, it seems that we react more to ozone than to the other pollutants, the traffic-related air pollutants, and especially endurance athletes have symptoms like they feel they're breathing more, so they get that more chest discomfort. And then when we actually measure their lung function post-exercise, um, with high levels of ozone, you may see a decrease in lung function in ozone that we don't see, say, when we're doing the particulate studies, we're using diesel exhaust. People are actually breathing basically uh, really sciencey exhaust from a Honda generator, a diesel Honda generator. That's what we have them breathe. And so we don't see huge acute effects in terms of health or performance from the diesel exhaust like we would see from ozone. And so for athletes especially, um, acutely the health effects of ozone are easier to detect. And there's a lot of
That's super
studies that back
interesting.
that up.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think that, I can imagine that it feels like an irritant, and we know that irritants, when you're ventilating a lot, don't feel so good in the lungs. So that makes a lot of sense. Translating that from we've talked about on the podcast here before, and in a bunch of my writing about like cold exposure in the lungs, and that makes a lot of sense that an irritant would not feel great. And you talked a little bit about the research there, and I kind of chuckled because I'm imagining trying to pass all this past like an ethics board or an IRB board. And I'm wondering, yes, we do know that the longitudinal like health effects of living in these environments, right? We know that children that grow up in urban centers are much more likely to have asthma. We know, increased all-cause mortality, decreased life expectancy, all these things. But from a performance side in the lab or in the field, I'm just kind of wondering nuts and bolts a little bit, like how do you examine performance detriments in how does that get set up and what does that look like as far as like how can we critically assess these changes in athletes when we're either doing, I guess, field studies or like contriving something in the lab setting?
Sure. So we always have this debate in terms of how best to assess performance. We typically, I would say, I think every single one of our studies related to air pollution has used cycling as the form of exercise. Um, and it's just because it's a bit more reproducible than running. And then with the equipment that we're using, measuring the gases that you breathe in and out, especially if we're providing uh, diesel exhaust or ozone to breathe, uh, it's just much easier on the bike. Now we always use a double blind design, meaning that the research participants, the athletes, they don't know what they're getting on that day. But at the same time, the researchers in the room don't know either. One person will know, just in case something goes wrong, but they're separated from the analysis. So the actual researchers don't know. So that way, we're trying to minimize any um, almost placebo effect, because if you're expecting to feel worse in the air pollution, you're going to feel worse in the air pollution. And we always use a crossover design, so every participant does both the clean air and the air pollution exposure, and they do it in a random order, and nobody knows which one's first. And then when we analyze it, we're always comparing them to themselves. And so typically it would be something like um, uh, a time trial, and or we either do a time trial or a 30 minutes sort of constant load at 60% of the power that you can put out at your VO2 max, which is um, a reasonably hard effort over that 30-minute period. pretty close to threshold for most people. And then we look at things like how you feel, heart rate, oxygen consumption, ventilation, and the rating of how good your legs feel, how your lungs feel. And one big limitation that I think is that the longest study that's been done looking really at performance was 90 minutes, a 90-minute time trial. And that was done at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And many of your, or most of your athletes probably are doing longer training efforts than 90 minutes, 4 or 5 hour bike rides or long runs for your ultra runners. And there's basically no proper research looking at air pollution effects over these long duration sessions. And so that's a huge caveat. And that's one of the sort of things that we would recommend during wildfire season or a high pollution bout is to really avoid those prolonged workouts, just because that's just such a high dose of air pollution for such a long time. So I think I rambled a bit there, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like we can expect that's not good for you, but we don't know to what extent it might not be good for you. Which I think is a safe thing to hedge, right? Like I think it's like the rest day is probably more important than um, toasting your lungs, so to speak. So in these studies, I think the one out of, was it Brazil? Did they look at critical power? Was there any other? I think they looked at critical power maybe on the bike. Just like trying to think of like measurable performance decreases that you're seeing with that exposure, as far as obviously there's lots of like subjective things like how did your lungs feel, how did your legs feel, that kind of stuff, but just kind of wondering from the objective lens to what we're seeing change in those environments that would be concerning to a coach or concerning to an athlete that should be considered.
Yeah, and so in the Brazilian study, that was Dr. Romulo Bertuzzi's lab, they did look at power output. And one of the great strengths of their study is they use, if you've ever been to Sao Paulo, you know that they have really good high quality air pollution there. And so they used authentic downtown Sao Paulo air pollution and pumped it right into the chamber where the athletes were exercising, and then the control condition was, perfectly filtered clean air. And so, um, uh, they did a really nice job there. And having that longer duration, 90 minutes, is good because all of our studies are only 30 minutes. In the future, we really need to go much longer, and we're designing a longer ozone study just to deal with that. So yes, looking at power output, this is why it always becomes a debate, is if you do a time trial and say, hey, ride 50 kilometers in both conditions, then one of those may be slightly longer. Let's say in the clean air, they do a little bit better and it's 5 minutes shorter or 3 minutes shorter over 50 kilometers. Then there's other differences, right? You have they're breathing for a shorter period of time, the exposure is shorter, the heat effects are different. And so the advantage is you're comparing power to power, but the disadvantage is the duration slightly off. And so we typically tend to go for a constant duration and then look at maybe softer athlete outcomes like oxygen consumption, heart rate, and rating of perceived exertion, so that we can really get an equal exposure in both. Because with that double blind design, it's amazing how bad people are at telling which day was the air pollution day and which day was the clean air day, because we use nose plugs on them. And it's about as good as flipping a coin. So that the blinding is actually good, so it's worth having them matched for time.
And then you said do you look at post ride lung function,
Yeah.
like just like right away, or is that staggered at all as far as like when those readings are taken?
Well, some of these things take time, so we like to go 90 to 2 hours afterwards, and to just because the whole thing is, another big take-home message is exercise is so good for us, right? All your listeners love exercise, hopefully. And one of the issues that we have with this research is the effects of exercise, especially intense exercise, are so profound on the body, just exercise alone opens up your airways of your lungs, increases your lung function, right? And so we want to follow them post-exercise until the beneficial effects of exercise have dissipated to see if we can tease out some negative effects of air pollution. And so, um, ideally we'd have them stay in the lab for 8 hours afterwards. But, some of these studies involve 18 visits by the participants, half of them breathing air pollution. So it's already asking a lot of them. So 2 hours is the longest that we've done with this particular study.
Yeah, you have to get them back to their undergraduate classes or their real jobs or whatever else they have going on besides being a guinea pig. Um, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think sometimes I know that might have been like a long researchy question for people, but I do think it's important to understand like where, we give recommendations based on research like this, both in the health and clinical space and in the athletic space. And I think it's important for people to understand like what goes into trying to tease out these answers so that we can hopefully make positive change in people's general health, but also in their athletic performance. So hopefully that's getting the gears turning for our listeners. I guess from there, I think the biggest question I get every single year, be it when it's super cold, be it when it's wildfire season, whatever it might be, it's my phone goes crazy, my email inbox goes crazy with athletes saying like, okay, like what AQI is the cutoff? Like when am I not supposed to exercise? When do I need to cut my run short or my bike short? When do I, bust out an N95 mask? When do I say, you know what, I'm going to exercise inside or I'm going to take a rest day? Because I know that it's really hard to be opportunistic for a lot of athletes who are not professional athletes, right? They have jobs and kids and everything else going on. So it's hard to maybe move that long run to a different day in their week. So I mean, maybe there's no clear answer here and we're all just kind of shooting in the dark a little bit when it comes to this, but do you think there are any broad, at least, health and performance recommendations that can be made for athletes who, like, wildfire season's around the corner out west for sure. I mean, it's already raging in Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado. Um, like, what can we tell them when the AQI becomes poor and they have to make that decision to move their workout, to cut their workout short, whatever it might be?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And the issue is too is that when the wildfire season hits, it's 2 or 3 weeks sometimes that you've got this low quality. So uh, you can't just say rest for 2 to 3 weeks, especially because you do that in middle of July. Your A race is in late August. That's going to have huge impacts. And so um, we we try to make a it's a bit, maybe it's a bit of a harm reduction model or it's a bit nuanced, but when things are particularly bad, uh, we orient athletes towards shorter, more intense workouts because we have shown that, especially with the more particulate air pollution, higher intensity doesn't lead to more acute health effects. And so
Interesting.
uh, that's sort of one in terms of pragmatic things. Number one is time of day is huge, and so there's uh, apps. The one that I have always used is called Plume, Plume. It's a French one, but I think they just got bought by Weather Underground. So it's if you use the Weather Underground one, I think it's integrated in there. And the thing about Plume is that it uses historical data, a bit of AI, and then weather forecasts to predict the pollution going forward, a day or two forward. And so it's really helpful, even during a bad wildfire season. The pollution is going to vary during the day as the wind changes. And as time of day and rush hour traffic changes, and you can see when the optimal time of day is to exercise outside to minimize your risk. And if you can make that work with your other commitments, work and family and stuff, that's helpful. So I guess the recommendations that we give are use these apps or websites to find the training areas that are lower in air pollution. So here I'm talking to you from Vancouver. Vancouver is at the I guess, at the mouth of a valley, at the base of some mountains. Often the pollution gets trapped up against the mountains. So if you're going to go for a training ride, if you go south and along the ocean, you're going to have much lower air pollution than if you do some climbing in the mountains. And so you can separate yourself from the air pollution or the worst air pollution by distance. And then you can use the forecasting functions of these apps to choose the best time of day. So those would be the first two things. The third thing would be on the really bad days, prioritize intensity over distance or duration. And so uh, that may be some time to work on, and obviously things like doing some strength workouts, some indoor, get that neglected core and flexibility that you haven't been doing. And if you have a good indoor environment, which isn't a given because uh, there's a lot of variation in how much of that air pollution gets indoors. If you do have a good indoor environment, then doing some of your workout indoors may be another suggestion as well. And then the other key one is if you're in wildfire season, you're exposed to 2 to 3 weeks of bad air, but you're exposed 24 hours a day. And that air pollution is bad for you 24 hours a day. And so the key is outside of your exercise, you still need to reduce your exposure to air pollution. And so um, finding good indoor environments in which to spend time when you're not exercising is good. You mentioned a mask, so you also mentioned an N95. And so by design, that is designed to reduce 95% of the particles. And so particles are the big stressor in wildfire season. And so an N95 a well-fitting N95 is really effective for that. It's not realistic to do intense exercise with an N95. You're just not going to get the volumes in and out. Some of them have an exhaust valve so that you draw in against resistance, but there's no resistance when you breathe out. But still, I don't think it'd be comfortable enough to exercise. So if you're wanting to reduce your exposure with a mask, I would say wear it whenever you're outside of exercise. And so when we're working with teams and stuff, we recommend uh, if they're in a high pollution environment, that they consider wearing masks on the way to and from training and to and from competition, especially because they're often in traffic in addition to the air pollution. So reducing your non-exercise air pollution exposure is helpful as well. It's bad for us 24 hours a day.
I think that's a big thing to note is that it is bad for us 24 hours a day. And we all became mask experts over the past 2 years. So I think it's, you can say N95 and people are like, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about right now, where we wouldn't have, I think, for many people 2 years ago. But as a California resident for the last 4 years, with wildfire season, we had our stash of N95s pre-pandemic and a very powerful air filter and bike trainers for that very reason, knowing that there was going to be a period of every summer where we might be very, very trapped in our homes, So I think you kind of have to adjust on the fly, and we're all adjusting to that. It seems like a longer fire season every single year. And then I actually the intensity thing kind of like I think that is counterintuitive and like very surprising, but also makes sense because your duration of total exposure would go down, even though your ventilation rate would go up for that kind of finite amount of time. Is there a limit to that? Or is there because I can see some athletes being like, okay, I'm going to not do my 2 hour run, but I'm going to do, you know, X number of minutes of VO2 max intervals. Is there any sort of practical recommendation as far as what's reasonable and what's unreasonable as we talk to an ultra running audience who
Yeah.
are known for going a little above and beyond?
Yeah, fair enough. So, Ed, you're 100% right to say it's counterintuitive. When we did this study, we were expecting to see big differences between high intensity and low intensity exercise. What we looked at was a 30-minute exposure at 60% of your power at VO2 max. So for some people, it was tough to finish that effort. And then 30 minutes, the same duration at 35%. And so even with the same duration, there was no increase in any of the effects during the high intensity. And so In terms of practical advice for your ultra audience, it's still keeping the duration under control. Uh, so I really would recommend when the pollution is bad, get into your best environment and be doing sub 60-minute intensity workouts. I think it would be a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, I think that's something that people can reasonably get behind, right? It gives them their dose of endorphins and their dose of moving their body and sweating for the day without the the bad effects that we're trying to avoid. Is there anything we're going to kind of wind down? I've got a couple kind of tangential questions before I let you go, but is there anything else kind of in this vein that you think it's important for athletes and or coaches to consider as we look ahead to a hot, warm, potentially smoggy, wildfire induced summer?
Yeah. Maybe a couple little minor tips. It seems that for the ozone air pollution, a diet high in antioxidants may help. And so hopefully a lot of your athletes eat quite clean for performance reasons and are already consuming lots of sort of, dark vegetables and blueberries and tart cherries and all that kind of stuff. But that seems to help at least with the ozone side of things. And having enough vitamin C and vitamin E seem to be helpful for that as well. Often people are looking for a nutritional input. And then probably the last other point that's interesting, especially to California residents, is people that are in a high ozone environment. If they go and compete in a high ozone environment, they do better than people from a low ozone environment. There seems to be for
Interesting.
ozone, not for the other pollutants, only for ozone, there seems to be a little bit of an adaptation process. It's not worth, moving to LA or Tokyo just to get ozonated, so you'll do better. But if you are going to be competing in an area that has high ozone for your A race, if you do get there a little bit early and do your heat acclimation at the same time as your ozone acclimation, because remember, the high temperature, high heat environments are also typically the high ozone environments. You may get a bit of a double benefit: heat acclimation and ozone acclimation.
That's super interesting that I mean bodies are incredibly smart and we adapt to things that I would think are impossible, but we keep doing it. So that's super interesting that there's this kind of adaptability mechanism at play. I kind of is there any inclination as to what is there a mechanistic cause for that, or do we have any idea why that might be?
Not not a clear idea yet. It probably has something to do with scavenging of free radicals or something like that. You know what? The one other point to make as we wind down is asthma is very common for everybody, but it's more common in endurance athletes. So the prevalence of asthma in your audience and in your clients is going to be higher than the general population. And some of these pollutants, especially the ozone, seems to irritate asthma more. And when your athletes are often in very remote areas, away from uh, rescue and that kind of thing, for the asthmatic athletes, I think it's worthwhile just making sure their asthma is well controlled before their workouts, and then having if they need an inhaler, typically have their rescue inhaler with them just to sort of manage when they're in a austere remote environment.
Yeah, that's super important. There's all sorts of weird breathing things that happens at these high, dry altitude 100-mile races that we don't quite understand, and they definitely kind of fall into that asthmatic irritant exposure camp that we don't quite fully understand yet. So we'll have to keep that in mind. That's a good note for anyone who does have asthma to keep their rescue inhaler on them on these runs. Okay, so to wind down, these are two questions that I've been asking everyone this season. Um, and they're kind of nice. They're a little bit tangential, but I think they kind of round everything out well. And so the first one being, if there, I'd like to know if there's something that you've listened to, read, or watched, and it can be related to this field. It can be related to your field, or just kind of adjacent to athletics in general that might be something that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I just started watching this podcast called, I think it's called Upside Strength. Uh, and I think that's what it is. One of my grad students recommended it, and it's kind of like they're short and they're kind of like sport related thought experiments. Um, the I think the one thing is about half of them he does. He's Swiss French, I think. So half of them are in French, but he does do some of them, or I think about half of them in English. But they're just kind of short little thought experiments related to sport, and uh, I found them kind of stimulating.
That's a good reason to have grad students. They're always listening to something that's interesting. So
Yeah.
upside strength will that's a good recommendation. I'm going to add it to my list. And then the last question I've been asking everyone is there something that you know now as an athlete, as a physician, as a researcher, any of those camps, any of those hats that you wish you knew earlier in your career?
Oh, geez. So much. I think probably, yeah, definitely. I would say, um, I, early on, I think I chose to avoid goals because they sounded too hard, you know, and I wanted to be an architect, but it sounded really hard, and I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I heard it was really hard, so I didn't kind of pursue that. And I think I've learned that what if you really want it, just put in the work and put in the time, and uh, you're gonna if you can't don't achieve it, you're certainly gonna learn a lot on the way anyway. And so I don't regret that I'm not an architect or some that, but it just kind of uh, it things will tend to work out if you stick to it and put in the effort and work at it long enough.
That's great. I love that the architecture thing seemed daunting, but an MD, PhD, it's not a big deal.
I don't know. I think I got a bit of luck there. Yeah.
We all find a little bit of luck along the
Yeah.
way, but I like that. Goals can be scary, but they make a lot of things worth it. Okay, truly the last question now, and this one I promise is an easy one. Where can our listeners find you? Is there a best place for them to look you up if they've got questions,
Yeah.
ideas, if they want to follow your research?
Yeah. So I'm crap on socials, but I am on Twitter at MSKOEHLE. So just my last name. And so we put up some of our studies on there, and I guess that's probably the best place to find me. I don't have a good website or anything like that. Too
That's
old.
okay. Low tech
Yeah.
Twitter works just fine.
Yeah.
Even the least active Twitter works okay. We're gonna link that in our show notes so then people can definitely find you if they've got questions about pollution and exercise and all of that good environmental physiology stuff. I want to thank you one more time for joining our podcast today. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much. And good luck to all your listeners. Hope you have a good season.
Yeah, they're gonna crush it.